The dust kicked up by his horse's hooves settled slowly in the evening air as Jake Sullivan rode into the small town of Cedar Creek. His weathered hands gripped the reins tighter than necessary, betraying the nervousness that coursed through his veins. After 3 years of wandering the frontier, working cattle drives and odd jobs, he had finally decided to settle down. At 32, Jake felt the weight of loneliness pressing down on his shoulders like a heavy winter coat. The town was smaller than he remembered from his brief visit 2 summers ago. Main Street stretched out before him, lined with modest wooden buildings that housed the general store, saloon, blacksmith, and a few other essential businesses. Oil lamps flickered to life in windows as shopkeepers prepared to close for the day. Jake had come here with a simple plan: find work, rent a room, perhaps court the school teacher he had heard about from other travelers. As he guided his horse toward the livery stable, movement caught his eye from across the street. A woman emerged from the general store, her arms full of packages wrapped in brown paper. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her dark hair, which was pinned up in a neat bun with a few rebellious strands catching the golden light of the setting sun. Jake's breath caught in his throat as she turned in his direction. Their eyes met across the dusty street, and time seemed to slow. She had the most beautiful green eyes he had ever seen, like spring grass after a gentle rain. Her face was heart-shaped with high cheekbones and full lips that curved into a slight smile when she noticed him staring. Jake felt his carefully planned words of introduction scatter like leaves in the wind. He had rehearsed what he would say when he met eligible women in town. He would tip his hat politely, introduce himself as a hard-working ranch hand looking for steady employment, and mention his respectable intentions. Instead, he found himself climbing down from his horse with clumsy movements, his usual grace abandoned in the presence of this unexpected beauty. The woman continued to look at him with curious eyes as he approached. One of her packages slipped from her arms, and Jake hurried forward to catch it before it hit the ground. His fingers brushed hers as he handed it back, and he felt a jolt of electricity run up his arm. "Thank you kindly," she said, her voice soft and melodious, with a slight southern accent that made his heart skip. "You're new in town." It wasn't a question, and Jake nodded, suddenly aware of how dusty and travel-worn he must appear. "Yes, ma'am. Name's Jake Sullivan." He managed to remove his hat, revealing sandy brown hair that was overdue for a cut. "I'm Emma Rose Carter," she replied, shifting the packages to extend her hand. "Welcome to Cedar Creek, Mr. Sullivan."
Jake
took her hand gently, marveling at its softness compared to his own calloused palm. He held it perhaps a moment too long, lost in the warmth of her touch and the way her eyes seemed to sparkle with intelligence and kindness. "Are you planning to stay long?" Emma asked, retrieving her hand, but making no move to walk away. "I'm hoping to find work and settle down," Jake heard himself say, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. "Been traveling too long. A man needs roots." Emma nodded thoughtfully. There's always work for honest men willing to put in effort. "Mr. Henderson at the ranch just outside town mentioned needing hands for the upcoming cattle drive. And Mrs. Patterson runs the boarding house, if you need a place to stay." Jake absorbed this information, while trying not to stare too obviously at the way the fading sunlight played across Emma's features. He wondered if she was married, but saw no ring on her finger. Perhaps she was spoken for by someone in town. A woman this beautiful surely wouldn't remain unattached long. "I appreciate the guidance, Miss Carter," he said, hoping his use of Miss would prompt her to correct him if needed. "It's Miss Carter," she confirmed with a smile that made Jake's pulse quicken. "I teach at the schoolhouse here in town." So, she was the schoolteacher he had heard about. Jake felt a surge of hope mixed with intimidation. He could read and write well enough, but Emma clearly possessed the kind of education and refinement that might be beyond his reach. Still, the way she looked at him suggested interest rather than dismissal. "Teaching's noble work," Jake said, searching for something intelligent to add. "Children need good guidance to grow up right." "I believe so," Emma agreed, "though it can be challenging when some of the older boys would rather be working ranches than learning arithmetic." A comfortable silence fell between them as other townspeople moved past, some nodding politely to Emma and casting curious glances at Jake. He was acutely aware that their conversation was likely being noted. and would become town gossip by morning. "I should let you get home before dark," Jake said reluctantly. Though every fiber of his being wanted to continue talking with her, Emma glanced at the packages in her arms as if suddenly remembering them. "Yes, I suppose I should. It was very nice meeting you, Mr. Sullivan. I hope you find what you're looking for in Cedar Creek." "I have a feeling I might," Jake replied, before he could stop himself. Emma's cheeks flushed pink at his words, and she ducked her head slightly. "Good evening, then." "Good evening, Miss Carter." Jake watched her walk away, noting the graceful way she moved and how she glanced back once before turning the corner. Only then did he realize he was still holding his hat in his hands like some lovesick schoolboy. Leading his horse toward the livery stable, Jake's mind raced with possibilities. He had come to Cedar Creek looking for a simple life and perhaps companionship, but Emma Rose Carter had ignited something far more intense within him. The desire he felt was unlike anything he had experienced before, not just physical attraction, well, that was certainly present, but a deeper longing to know everything about her as he made arrangements for his horse and gathered his few belongings. Jake knew that his plans for a quiet, orderly courtship had been completely derailed by one look into Emma's green eyes. Tomorrow, he would find work and a place to stay, but tonight he would dream of the schoolteacher who had stolen his words and possibly his heart in the span of a few minutes on a dusty street in Cedar Creek. Dawn broke over Cedar Creek with the promise of a scorching day ahead. Jake had slept poorly in the boarding house, his mind replaying every moment of his encounter with Emma Rose Carter. Mrs. Patterson, a kindly widow with silver hair and knowing eyes, had provided him with a simple but clean room and a hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. "You met our schoolteacher yesterday," Mrs. Patterson observed as she poured coffee into his cup. It wasn't a question, confirming Jake's suspicion that news traveled fast in small towns. "Yes, ma'am. Seemed like a fine lady," Jake replied, trying to keep his tone casual. Mrs. Patterson's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Emma Rose is special, that's certain. Came here from Georgia 3 years ago after her father passed. Smart as a whip and pretty as a picture, but she keeps to herself mostly. Focuses on her teaching and helping folks when they need it." Jake absorbed this information while trying not to appear too eager for more details. "She mentioned Mr. Henderson might need ranch hands." "That he does. Lost 2 men last month when they decided to try their luck in California. Tom Henderson's a fair man, pays decent wages for honest work." Mrs. Patterson studied Jake's face carefully. "You planning to court our Emma?" The directness of the question caught Jake off guard, and he nearly choked on his coffee. "I just met her yesterday, ma'am. Barely had a proper conversation." "Sometimes that's all it takes," Mrs. Patterson said with a knowing smile. "My late husband knew he wanted to marry me 5 minutes after we met. Took him 3 months to work up the courage to ask, though." After breakfast, Jake made his way to Henderson's ranch, which lay about 2 miles outside town. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers. As he rode, Jake found his thoughts drifting repeatedly to Emma's smile and the way her voice had sounded, saying his name. Tom. Henderson proved to be a weathered man in his 50s with graying hair and shrewd but honest eyes. He looked Jake over carefully, asking pointed questions about his experience with cattle and horses. Jake answered truthfully, mentioning his work on drives from Texas to Kansas and his time breaking horses in Colorado. "You come with references?" Henderson asked. Jake produced a letter from his last employer, a ranch owner in Colorado, who had been sorry to see him go. Henderson read it carefully, then nodded. "Says here you're reliable and good with horses. Can you handle the rough stock?" "Yes." "Sir, never met a horse I couldn't work with given time and patience." Henderson offered him the job at $30 a month plus meals and a bunk in the ranch house. It was fair wages for the work, and Jake accepted immediately. Would start the following Monday, giving him the weekend to settle in properly. As he rode back toward town, Jake's mind turned inevitably to Emma. He wondered what she did on Saturdays when there was no school. Perhaps she spent time reading or preparing lessons for the coming week. The thought of her bent-over books, her dark hair catching the light, made his chest tighten with longing. He was so lost in thought that he almost missed seeing her again. Emma stood outside the church with an older woman Jake didn't recognize, both of them carrying baskets covered with checkered cloth. They appeared to be heading somewhere with purpose. Jake dismounted and approached respectfully, removing his hat. "Good morning, Miss Carter." Emma looked up with surprise that quickly transformed into pleasure. "Mr. Sullivan." "Good morning. How are you settling in?" "Very well, thank you. Mr. Henderson hired me on." "I'll start Monday." "That's wonderful news." Tom Henderson is good people. Emma's genuine enthusiasm for his success warmed Jake's heart. She turned to her companion. "Mrs. Collins, this is Mr. Jake Sullivan, the new ranch hand I mentioned." "Mr. Sullivan, this is Mrs. Collins. She's the pastor's wife." Mrs. Collins, a plump woman with kind eyes, nodded approvingly. "Welcome to our community, Mr. Sullivan. We're always glad to have hard-working folks join us." "Thank you, ma'am. It's a fine town." Emma shifted her basket and glanced toward the edge of town. "We're taking food to the Murphy family. Their youngest has been sick, and Mrs. Murphy hasn't been able to keep up with everything." The mention of helping others in need struck Jake as perfectly fitting with what he was learning about Emma's character. "That's mighty kind of you both. Would you like to come along?" Emma asked suddenly, then seemed surprised by her own invitation. "I mean, if you're not busy. The Murphy children always enjoy meeting new people, and Mr. Murphy might appreciate talking with another man." Mrs. Collins shot Emma a meaningful look, but said nothing. Jake felt his heart leap at the unexpected opportunity to spend more time. "In Emma's company, I'd be honored to help," he said. The Murphy homestead sat in a small valley about a mile from town. As they approached, Jake could see that the family was struggling. The small house needed repairs, and the garden looked neglected. Several young children played in the dirt yard, their clothes patched but clean. Mrs. Murphy, a thin woman with tired eyes, greeted Emma and Mrs. Collins with obvious relief and gratitude. Her husband, Pat Murphy, emerged from behind the house, where he had been attempting to fix a broken fence post. Emma introduced Jake, who immediately offered to help with the fence repair. Pat Murphy, a proud man despite his circumstances, initially declined, but eventually accepted when Jake insisted it would be no trouble. While the men worked on the fence, Emma and Mrs. Collins went inside to check on the sick child and help Mrs. E. Murphy organized the food they had brought. Jake found himself stealing glances at the house, hoping to catch sight of Emma through the windows. Pat Murphy proved to be good company, a former soldier who had come west seeking opportunity but found mostly hardship. His wife had been ill recently, making it difficult to maintain their small farm and care for their 4 children. "Emma rose as an angel," Pat said as they reset the fence post. "She's been helping us since Margaret took sick last month.
Never asks
for anything in return, just shows up when we need her most." Jake's admiration for Emma grew as he listened to Pat's stories of her kindness. She had organized food donations, helped teach the older Murphy children when they couldn't attend school regularly, and even assisted with household chores when Mrs. Murphy was too weak to manage alone. When the fence repair was complete, Emma emerged from the house with flour on her apron and a satisfied smile. She had been helping to bake bread and prepare a meal for the family. Jake thought she looked even more beautiful with her sleeves rolled up and her hair slightly mussed from work. The ride back to town was pleasant, with Mrs. Collins chatting about church matters while Jake and Emma rode side by side. Emma thanked him several times for helping the Murphys, her praise making Jake feel 10 feet tall. As they reached the edge of town, Mrs. Collins announced she needed to stop at the general store, leaving Jake and Emma alone for a few precious minutes. "You have a good heart, Miss Carter," Jake said quietly. "What you do for families like the Murphys means everything to them." Emma's cheeks flushed pink. "It's what neighbors should do for each other. We all need help sometimes." Jake wanted to tell her that her kindness made him admire her even more, that watching her care for others had only intensified his growing feelings for her. Instead, he simply said, "You're right. I hope I can be the kind of neighbor this community needs." Smile was radiant. "I think you will be, Mr. Sullivan. I think you will be." 3 weeks had passed since Jake began working at Henderson's ranch, and he had fallen into a comfortable routine. Each morning before dawn, he would tend to the horses, mend fences, and help drive cattle to fresh grazing areas. The work was demanding, but satisfying. and Tom Henderson had proven to be a fair boss who appreciated Jake's skill with the more difficult horses, but it was the evenings that Jake treasured most. Several times a week he would find reasons to visit town, always hoping for a glimpse of Emma Rose Carter. Sometimes he would see her walking to the general store or tending to the small garden behind the schoolhouse. They would exchange pleasantries, and each conversation left Jake wanting more. The other ranch hands had begun to tease him about his frequent trips to town, but Jake endured their good-natured ribbing without complaint. What they didn't understand was the intensity of what he felt for Emma. It went far beyond simple attraction or the loneliness that often drove frontier men to seek female companionship. Emma had awakened something deeper in him, a longing not just for her presence, but for the life they might build together. On this particular Saturday evening, Jake had cleaned up thoroughly and put on his best shirt before riding into town. Annual harvest dance was being held in the schoolhouse, and he had spent the better part of the week working up courage to ask Emma to dance. His hands trembled slightly as he tied his horse to the hitching post outside the schoolhouse. Music and laughter spilled out through the open windows. Paper lanterns had been strung around the building, casting warm golden light over the couples and families gathered in the yard. Jake recognized most of the faces now, having been introduced around town by Mrs. Patterson and others, who had taken a liking to the quiet, hard-working newcomer. He spotted Emma immediately, even in the crowded room. She wore a dress of deep green. That brought out her eyes, and her hair was arranged in an elegant style, with small white flowers tucked among the dark strands. She was talking with several other women near the refreshment table, her animated gestures and bright laughter drawing admiring glances from several unmarried men in the room. Jake's confidence wavered as he watched those men position themselves near Emma, clearly hoping for a chance to dance with her. Among them was Robert Chandler, the banker's son who had recently returned from college back east. Robert was well-dressed, educated, and came from one of the most prosperous families in the county, everything that Jake was not. You planning to stand in the doorway all evening? Or are you going to ask her to dance? Jake turned to find Tom Henderson beside him, dressed in his Sunday best and grinning knowingly. The older man had become something of a mentor to Jake, offering advice on everything from horse training to frontier life. "I'm not sure I should," Jake admitted. "Look at those other fellows. They're more her type than a ranch hand like me." Henderson shook his head. "Son, I've been watching Emma Rose Carter for 3 years now, and I've seen plenty of men try to court her. She's polite to all of them, but she's never looked at any of them the way she looks at you." "What do you mean? Haven't you noticed? When you're around, she gets that soft look in her eyes, and she smiles different. More genuine. Trust me, I've been married twice, and I know when a woman's interested." Before Jake could respond, the music changed to a waltz, and he watched Robert Chandler approach Emma with confident steps. Emma accepted his invitation graciously, but Jake noticed she glanced around the room as Robert led her to the dance floor. Her eyes found his across the crowded space. She offered him a warm smile that made his heart race. Jake forced himself to move away from the wall and mingle with the other guests, but he found it difficult to focus on conversations while watching Emma dance with a succession of partners. She moved gracefully, her skirts swirling with each turn, but Jake thought he detected a certain politeness rather than genuine enjoyment in her interactions. When the current song ended, Jake saw his chance. Emma had thanked her latest partner and was walking toward the refreshment table. Jake intercepted her path, his mouth dry with nervousness. "Miss Carter, you look beautiful tonight," he said, immediately feeling foolish for such a direct compliment. But Emma's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. I was hoping you would come tonight. Are you enjoying yourself?" "Am now," Jake replied honestly. "Would you do me the honor of the next dance?" Emma's smile was radiant. "I would love to." The musicians struck up another waltz, and Jake led Emma onto the dance floor with careful steps. He had learned to dance as a young man, but it had been years since he had needed the skill. Emma followed his lead gracefully, and after a few moments, Jake's confidence returned. "You dance very well," Emma said as they moved together. "Where did you learn?" "My mother insisted all her children learn proper social graces," Jake replied. "She said you never knew when you might need them." "A wise woman. What was she like?" Jake found himself telling Emma about his family while they danced. His parents had owned a small farm in Missouri, and his mother had indeed insisted on education and refinement despite their modest circumstances. Both parents had died of fever when Jake was in his early 20s. Leaving him free to wander west in search of adventure and opportunity, Emma listened intently, asking thoughtful questions. That showed her genuine interest in his background. As they talked and danced, Jake marveled at how natural it felt to be with her. The nervousness he had carried for weeks began to fade, replaced by a sense of rightness, as if this was where he belonged. "What brought you to teaching?" Jake asked, as the waltz continued. Emma's expression grew slightly wistful. "My father was a teacher back in Georgia. After my mother died when I was 12, he raised me largely in the schoolhouse. I grew to love learning and helping others discover new ideas. When he passed, I decided to continue his work. It must have been hard, leaving everything familiar behind," was Emma admitted. "But sometimes we need to leave what's comfortable to find what's right. I've been happy here in Cedar Creek." Music came to an end too soon for Jake's liking. As they separated, Emma's hand lingered in his for just a moment longer than necessary. The brief contact sent warmth shooting up Jake's arm and straight to his heart. "Thank you for the dance," Emma said softly. "It was lovely." Before Jake could ask for another dance, Robert Chandler appeared at Emma's elbow, his face showing obvious displeasure at finding her with Jake. "Miss Carter, I believe you promised me the next dance," Robert said, his tone polite but challenging. Emma looked uncertain, glancing between the two men. "I don't recall promising, Mr. Chandler, but I suppose one more dance would be fine." Watched them walk away, noting how stiff Emma's posture became in Robert's arms. The banker's son held her too closely and spoke constantly in her ear, making her expression grow increasingly uncomfortable. Tom Henderson appeared beside Jake again. "Don't look so worried, son. A blind man could see she'd rather be dancing with you." Jake hoped his employer was right, but doubt crept in as he watched Robert's confident manner with Emma. When the dance ended, Robert kept Emma's hand and led her toward a quieter corner of the room, clearly intending to monopolize her time. Jake's jaw clenched as he watched Emma try to extract herself politely from Robert's persistent attention. Other people were beginning to notice the interaction, some whispering behind their hands. Emma's discomfort was becoming obvious, but Robert seemed oblivious or uncaring. Jake had spent his life avoiding confrontation when possible, but watching Emma's growing distress stirred something protective within him. Without fully considering the consequences, he walked across the room toward the pair, his intention clear in every determined step. Jake's boots clicked against the wooden floor as he approached the corner. Where Robert Chandler was still holding Emma's attention against her obvious wishes, Emma's eyes widened with relief when she saw Jake coming toward them, her expression clearly conveying her gratitude for the rescue. "Excuse me," Jake said politely but firmly, "but I believe Miss Carter promised me another dance." Robert turned with an annoyed expression, his pale blue eyes cold with displeasure. "I don't believe she did. We're having a private conversation." Emma seized the opportunity to step closer to Jake. "Actually, I did promise Mr. Sullivan another dance." "Thank you for the lovely waltz, Mr. Chandler." Robert's face flushed red, but he couldn't argue without appearing ungentlemanly in front of the other townspeople, who were now openly watching the exchange. "Of course, perhaps later this evening, Miss Carter." "Perhaps," Emma replied diplomatically, but Jake could hear the reluctance in her voice. As Robert stalked away, Jake offered Emma his arm. "Would you like to step outside for some fresh air? It's gotten quite warm in here." "That sounds wonderful," Emma said, with obvious relief. They walked together toward the door, and Jake felt the eyes of the entire gathering following their movement. He knew that by tomorrow morning, everyone in Cedar Creek would be talking about how he had rescued the school teacher from Robert Chandler's unwanted advances. The night air was cool and sweet with the scent of autumn flowers. Paper lanterns cast dancing shadows across the schoolyard. The sound of music and laughter drifted out from the building behind them. Several other couples had also stepped outside, some walking in the garden and others sitting on benches. Placed around the yard, Emma sighed deeply as they walked toward a quieter area near the edge of the property. "Thank you for that. Mr. Chandler can be quite persistent when he sets his mind to something." He seemed to be making you uncomfortable. Jake said, I hope I didn't overstep by intervening. Emma stopped walking and turned to face him, her green eyes serious in the lantern light. You didn't overstep at all? Robert has been increasingly forward lately, and I've been running out of polite ways to discourage him.
Oh.
Jake felt a surge of protective anger at the thought of Robert pressuring Emma. Has he been bothering you often, more frequently, since his return from college? He seems to think his education and family position entitle him to whatever he wants. Emma's voice carried a note of frustration that Jake had never heard before. They found a bench beneath a large oak tree at the edge of the schoolyard. Far enough from the building to have some privacy, but still within sight of the other guests. Emma arranged her skirts carefully as she sat, and Jake settled beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. Tell me about your life before you came here, Emma said, seeming to want a change of subject. You mentioned traveling a lot? Jake found himself sharing more than he had intended, talking about his years of wandering from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to form deep connections. He told her about the loneliness that had driven him to keep moving, always hoping the next town or job would provide what he was searching for. And did you find it? Emma asked softly. Jake looked at her profile in the moonlight, noting the gentle curve of her cheek and the way her hair caught the silver light. I think I might have. Emma met his gaze, and Jake saw something shift in her expression. The polite interest she showed everyone was replaced by something warmer and more personal. Jake, she said, using his first name for the first time. Need to tell you something? What is it? Emma was quiet for a moment, seeming to gather her thoughts. When you first arrived in town, I thought you were just another drifter who would stay a few months and move on. But watching you these past weeks, seeing how kind you are to people like the Murphy family and how hard you work, I've realized I was wrong. Jake's heart began to beat faster. What do you mean? I mean that you're the kind of man this community needs. The kind of man who makes a place better just by being in it. Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. The kind of man a woman could build a life with. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Jake reached for Emma's hand, and she didn't pull away when he gently took it in his own. Emma, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I came to Cedar Creek looking for a place to settle down, but I never expected to find someone like you. You've turned my whole world upside down. Emma's free hand came up to touch his cheek gently. How so? I can't think of anything else but you. When I'm working, I'm counting the hours until I might see you in town. When I'm lying in my bunk at night, I'm wondering what you're doing. If you're reading or grading papers or just sitting by your window looking at the stars. Emma's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her smile was radiant. I've been doing the same thing, wondering about you, hoping you'd find reasons to come to town, feeling disappointed on the days when I don't see you. Jake felt as if his heart might burst from his chest. Emma, I know I'm just a ranch hand without much to offer, but I want you to know that my feelings for you are serious. More serious than anything I've ever felt. Money and position aren't everything, Jake. Character matters more, and you have more character in your little finger than some men have in their whole bodies. Jake thought of Robert Chandler and his persistent pursuit of Emma, despite her obvious discomfort. Speaking of character, I want you to know that if Chandler continues to bother you, you can come to me. I won't let anyone make you uncomfortable. Squeezed his hand. You're sweet to offer protection, but I can handle Robert. He's more bluster than real threat. Still, the offer stands. I care about you too much to see anyone trouble you. Emma was quiet for a long moment, and Jake began to worry he had said too much too soon. But when she spoke, her words filled him with joy. I care about you too, Jake, more than I probably should, after such a short acquaintance. There's no rule about how long it takes to recognize something real, Jake said. My boss told me tonight that he knew he wanted to marry his first wife within minutes of meeting her. Emma laughed softly. Mrs. Patterson told me the same story about her late husband. She said some people just know. Do you think we know? Jake asked, hardly daring to hope. Emma was quiet for so long that Jake began to panic, thinking he had pushed too far too fast. But finally, she nodded slowly. I think we might, she whispered. Jake felt as if he could conquer mountains. He brought Emma's hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture that was both tender and respectful. "Emma Rose Carter," he said formally. "Would you allow me to court you properly?" "I would be honored, Jake Sullivan." She replied with tears of happiness in her eyes as they sat together under the stars. Jake marveled at how his life had changed in the span of a few weeks. He had come to Cedar Creek looking for a simple life, but Emma had given him something far more precious: hope for a future filled with love and purpose. The weeks following the harvest dance brought a golden autumn to Cedar Creek, and with it, the sweetest period of Jake's life. True to his word, he courted Emma properly, calling on her twice a week at respectable times and always treating her with the utmost respect and consideration. Their courtship became the talk of the town, but in the most positive way. People smiled when they saw Jake and Emma walking together after church on Sundays, or sharing quiet conversations on Emma's front porch in the early evenings. Mrs. Patterson beamed with satisfaction, claiming she had predicted their romance from the moment Jake first mentioned Emma's name. Jake had never experienced happiness like this. Everything seemed brighter and more meaningful with Emma in his life. The work at Henderson's ranch felt less burdensome because he knew it was building toward a future with her. Even the simplest pleasures, like watching sunrise paint the mountains, or listening to meadowlarks sing, took on new significance because he imagined sharing such moments with Emma for years to come. Emma, too, seemed to bloom in Jake's attention. Her natural warmth and kindness became even more pronounced, and she laughed more freely than anyone in town could remember. The children at school noticed the change in their teacher, commenting that Miss Carter seemed especially happy and patient these days, but not everyone in Cedar Creek was pleased with the developing romance. Robert Chandler's initial annoyance had grown into something darker and more determined. His family's wealth and influence had always ensured he got what he wanted, and Emma Carter's preference for a simple ranch hand over himself was both incomprehensible and unacceptable to him. Robert began making pointed comments around town about Jake's suitability for someone of Emma's education and refinement. He questioned whether a drifter who had appeared from nowhere could truly provide for a woman of quality, and he made sure these doubts reached the ears of Cedar Creek's more prominent families. Jake became aware of the campaign against him when Tom Henderson pulled him aside one afternoon while they were breaking horses in the ranch corral. "Son, there's something you need to know," Henderson said, leaning against the fence rail. "Robert Chandler's been spreading talk around town about you and Emma." Jake's jaw tightened as he listened to Henderson explain Robert's whisper campaign. The banker's son was questioning Jake's past, suggesting he might be running from something, implying that Emma was making a mistake that would ruin her reputation and career. "What kind of talk exactly?" Jake asked, though he could guess. "The nature of Robert's implications. Just questions about your background and suggestions that Emma deserves better than a rootless cowhand. Most folks aren't paying him much attention, but some of the stuffier families are starting to listen." Jake felt his carefully built happiness begin to crack. He had always known that his humble circumstances might be seen as inadequate for someone like Emma, but hearing it put into words by Robert Chandler stung more than he cared to admit. "Maybe he's right," Jake said quietly. "Maybe Emma does deserve better than what I can offer." Henderson snorted with disgust. "That's exactly what Chandler wants you to think." "Don't let that pampered fool get in your head, Jake. Emma's a grown woman who can make her own choices, and she's chosen you." That evening, Jake called on Emma, as usual, but he found it difficult to concentrate on their conversation. Emma quickly noticed his distraction and pressed him gently for the cause. "Something's troubling you, Jake." "What is it?" Jake hesitated, not wanting to burden Emma with Robert's petty machinations, but her concerned expression convinced him to be honest. "Tom Henderson told me that Robert Chandler's been talking around town, questioning whether I'm good enough for you." Emma's green eyes flashed with anger, an emotion Jake had rarely seen from her. "What exactly has he been saying?" Jake reluctantly repeated what Henderson had told him, watching Emma's expression grow more indignant with each word. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her hands clenched in her lap. "I'm sorry, Emma. Maybe it would be better if I stepped back. Let you consider whether what we have is worth the trouble it's causing." Emma stood abruptly from the porch swing, her movement so sudden it startled Jake. "Jacob Sullivan, if you think I'm going to let Robert Chandler or anyone else dictate who I care about, you don't know me very well." The fire in her voice both surprised and thrilled Jake. He had seen Emma's gentleness and kindness, but this was the first glimpse of the steel beneath her soft exterior. "I didn't mean to suggest you couldn't make your own choices," Jake said carefully, "but maybe folks are right. Maybe you do deserve someone who can offer you more than a ranch hand's wages." Emma turned to face him fully, her eyes blazing. "What?" "I deserve as a man who treats me with respect, who shares my values, who makes me feel like the most important person in the world when he looks at me. That man is you, Jake, not Robert Chandler with all his family money and college education." Jake felt his heart swell at her passionate defense of their relationship. He stood and reached for her hands, finding them trembling slightly with the force of her emotions. "I love you, Emma," he said simply. The words came out before he could stop them, but he realized he had been wanting to say them for weeks. Emma's anger melted into something softer and infinitely more precious. "I love you too, Jake. I have 4 weeks now." They stood there on the porch, hands clasped, and hearts finally opened to each other, while the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Jake had never felt such complete contentment, such certainty that he was exactly where he belonged. But their moment of perfect happiness was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, and Jake recognized Robert Chandler's voice even before he could make out the faces. "Miss Carter," Robert called as he dismounted, followed by 2 other young men from prominent local families. "I hope we're not interrupting anything important." Emma's grip on Jake's hands tightened, and he could feel the tension radiating from her body. "Good evening, Mr. Chandler. It's rather late for social calls." Robert stepped into the circle of light cast by the porch lamp, his face wearing a smug expression that Jake wanted to wipe away with his fists. "I wanted to speak with you about something important." "Evidently." "Anything you have to say to me can be said in front of Mr. Sullivan," Emma replied coolly. Robert's companions exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the situation they had been dragged into. One of them, young Peter Williams, whose father owned the hardware store, looked as if he would rather be anywhere else. "Very well," Robert said with theatrical reluctance. "I've come to offer you one final chance to reconsider this unfortunate attachment you've formed. A woman of your breeding and education deserves better than a drifter with no prospects." Jake felt his temper rising but forced himself to remain calm for Emma's sake. Emma, however, had no such restraint. "How dare you," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "How dare you come to my home and insult the man I love? You have no right to judge Jake or to dictate my choices." Robert's facade of gentlemanly concern slipped, revealing the petulant anger beneath. "I'm trying to save you from making the biggest mistake of your life." This man appeared from nowhere with no references, no family, nothing but the clothes on his back. "What do you really know about him?" "I know he's twice the man you are," Emma shot back. "I know he works hard, treats people with kindness, and doesn't try to force his attention on unwilling women." Jake stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Emma's shoulder. "I think you've said enough, Chandler. The lady has made her feelings clear." Robert's face twisted with rage. "Don't think this is over, Sullivan. I know your type. You'll take what you can get from her and move on to the next town when something better comes along."
"That's enough,"
Jake said, his voice carrying a warning that made Robert's companions shift nervously. But Robert was too angry to heed the warning. "You want to know what I think? I think you're running from something. No man just appears out of nowhere without a past he's trying to hide." The accusation hung in the air like a physical blow. Jake felt Emma stiffen beside him, and he knew that Robert's words had found their mark, planting seeds of doubt even in Emma's trusting heart. "Get off my property," Emma said quietly, but her voice carried absolute authority. "All of you now." Robert opened his mouth to argue, but something in Emma's expression stopped him. He remounted his horse with as much dignity as he could muster. "Think about what I've said, Miss Carter. When you come to your senses, I'll be waiting." As the 3 riders disappeared into the darkness, Emma turned back to Jake with troubled eyes, the magical moment they had shared seemed like hours ago instead of minutes. "Jake," she said softly, "is there anything about your past that I should know?" Jake's heart clenched at the doubt he heard in Emma's voice. Knowing that Robert's poisonous words had accomplished exactly what they were intended to do, he looked into Emma's troubled eyes and realized that this moment would determine the fate of their love. He could deflect her question, give partial truths, or trust her completely with the story he had never told anyone in Cedar Creek. "Yes," he said simply. "There is something you should know." Emma's face went pale in the lamplight, but she gestured for him to sit beside her on the porch swing. "Tell me." Jake took a deep breath, knowing that his next words might cost him everything he had found in Cedar Creek. "I wasn't entirely truthful about why I left Missouri. My parents did die of fever. That part was true. But there was more to my leaving than just wanting to see the frontier." Emma waited silently, her hands folded in her lap, giving him the space to find his words. "After my parents died, I inherited the farm, but it was heavily mortgaged. I tried to make it work, but the crops failed 2 years running, and the bank threatened foreclosure. The banker was corrupt, charging illegal interest rates and taking advantage of desperate farmers." Jake paused, remembering the anger and helplessness he had felt as a young man watching his family's legacy slip away. "I confronted him publicly, accused him of cheating farmers out of their land. It caused a big scandal in town. The banker was eventually investigated and removed, but he had powerful friends who blamed me for ruining him." Emma's expression had softened slightly, but Jake could see she was still waiting for the real confession. "One night, 3 of his associates came to my farm. They said I needed to leave town or face consequences. When I refused, they tried to burn down my barn." Jake's voice grew harder. "I stopped them, but in the fight, one of them hit his head on a rock. He was badly hurt." Emma drew in a sharp breath. "Did he? ... He lived, but he was never the same. Simple-minded after that. His friends claimed I attacked them without provocation, that I was dangerous. The sheriff was in the banker's pocket, and I knew I'd never get a fair hearing." Jake met Emma's eyes directly, so I ran, left everything behind, and headed west. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of Jake's revelation. Emma stared at her hands, and Jake felt his world crumbling around him. "Emma," he said desperately, "I never meant to hurt that man. I was just trying to protect my property, my parents' memory. But I understand if you can't accept what I've done." Emma looked up at him, and Jake was surprised to see tears in her eyes, but not the kind he had expected. "You poor man," she said, softly, "all these years, carrying that burden alone. You're not horrified? Disgusted?" Emma reached for his hands. "Jake, you were barely more than a boy, alone and desperate, defending yourself against men who were trying to destroy your home. What happened was tragic, but it wasn't murder or cruelty. It was self-defense." Jake felt as if a massive weight was lifting from his chest. "But I ran instead of facing the consequences. And you ran because you knew the system was corrupt and you wouldn't receive justice? It's not cowardice. That's survival." Emma's voice grew stronger. "The man I've come to love would never hurt someone intentionally. I know your character, Jake Sullivan, and nothing you've told me changes that." Jake brought Emma's hands to his lips, overcome with gratitude and love. "I was so afraid you'd send me away. The only thing that would send me away is if you had. Lead to me about it. Thank you for trusting me with the truth." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both processing the significance of what had been shared and overcome. "What do we do about Robert?" Emma asked eventually. "I don't know. He's not going to give up easily, and now he's got more ammunition to use against me." Emma's jaw set with determination. "Let him try. The people in this town know us both, and they can judge for themselves who deserves their respect." Over the next few days, Jake waited anxiously to see if Robert would make good on his implied threat to spread Jake's story around town. But to his surprise, nothing happened. Robert seemed to have disappeared entirely, not even appearing at church on Sunday, as was his usual custom. The mystery was solved when Tom Henderson rode out to find Jake on Wednesday morning, his face grim with news. "Son, we need to talk. Robert Chandler left town yesterday, but not before sending a telegram to the sheriff in Missouri asking about you." Jake's blood ran cold. What kind of response did he get?
Nothing yet, but word is he's planning to come.
Back with proof of whatever he thinks he can dig up about your past. Henderson studied Jake's face carefully. Is there something you need to tell me? Jake had grown to trust and respect his employer completely, and Emma's acceptance of his story had given him courage. He told Henderson the whole truth, just as he had told Emma. Henderson listened without interruption, nodding occasionally. When Jake finished, the older man was quiet for several minutes. That's a hell of a thing to carry around, Henderson said finally. But I don't see anything in that story that changes my opinion of you. You were protecting yourself and your property against criminals, but if the Missouri sheriff decides to pursue it, then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. The meantime, you keep working, keep courting Emma, and keep being the good man I know you are. That evening, Jake found Emma waiting for him on her porch, her face bright with determination. I've been thinking about what you told me, she said without preamble, and I've made a decision. Jake's heart began to race, fearing she had reconsidered her acceptance of his past. I think we should be married as soon as possible. Jake stared at her in shock. Emma, are you sure? With all this uncertainty about Robert's investigation, I'm sure because of that uncertainty, Emma interrupted. If there's going to be trouble, I want to face it as your wife, not just as someone who cares about you. I want everyone in this town to know exactly where I stand. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. Emma Rose Carter, are you proposing to me? Emma laughed, the sound like music in the evening air. I suppose I am, in a way, but I'd prefer if you did the asking properly. Jake dropped to one knee right there on the porch, taking Emma's hands in his. Emma Rose Carter, will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a man with a complicated past but a heart full of love for you? Yes, Emma said without hesitation. Yes, I will. As Jake stood and took Emma in his arms for their first real kiss, he marveled at the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had come to Cedar Creek looking for a simple life, but Emma had given him something far more precious. Unconditional love and the courage to face whatever the future might bring. 3 weeks later, as Jake and Emma exchanged vows in the small church, with most of the town in attendance, Jake caught sight of Tom Henderson's satisfied smile and Mrs. Patterson dabbing at her eyes with her handkerchief. Robert Chandler's chair remained conspicuously empty, but Jake barely noticed. His attention was completely focused on the beautiful woman who had chosen to bind her life to his. Past and all, the telegram from Missouri arrived the day after their wedding, but its contents no longer mattered. The sheriff had found no grounds for prosecution. The injured man had recovered enough to work, and the corrupt banker had died 2 years earlier. Jake's past was finally truly behind him, as he and Emma stood on the porch of their new home. Watching the sunset paint the mountains, gold and red, Jake reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought him to this perfect moment. He had wanted love, but when he saw Emma that first day in Cedar Creek, desire had overcome every word he had planned to say. That desire had grown into something deeper and more lasting than he had ever imagined. A love that could weather any storm and grow stronger with each passing day.